Hi, everybody. I'm with Professor Kelly Szott here at Southern Oregon University. She is with the Sociology and Human Service Department and is interested in the sociology of drug use and addiction. I think I'm correct to say your current project focuses on heroin use and harm reduction and is kind of based on a concern for the way drug users are treated by the institutions that are really supposed to be caring for them. Did I get most of that right anyway?
That was perfect.
All
Yes.
right. Well, welcome and thank you for coming in today.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Let's take a look as I'd like to do with each of my guests. I want to know a little bit about you, and then we'll get into what you're up to here at SOU. So, how did you come to choose SOU? What was the path that brought you to us?
Well, I could go way back and start with how I got my sort of research interest in substance use,
Okay.
which connects to how I ended up at SOU.
All right.
Um, so after graduating with a bachelor's degree, I ended up working at a agency in Detroit called Alternatives for Girls, and it was serving at-risk young women. And I became very interested in a program there that was doing street outreach to sex workers.
Hmm.
And what one piece of that interest, besides it just being really compelling work, was that one day in the offices, I encountered this little baggie, a Ziploc bag that had a couple vials of water in it, a bottle of bleach, I think some gauze, and maybe some alcohol swabs. And I was like, what is this? And it turns out it was a safer injection kit. So it was to be distributed to people who were injecting drugs and to help them avoid contracting HIV. So this was the early 2000s. So HIV was, and it is still an issue. Actually, it's
Yes.
becoming more of an issue nowadays.
Oh,
There's a resurgence. So that is a method of harm reduction. And that really interested me. And so that kind of propelled me into that field, just that moment of interest there. And I ended up moving to New York City and working as a methadone counselor. Um, at a methadone clinic, and I was doing harm reduction counseling there. And then, so this kind of got my interest in substance abuse and understanding drug use. And then I had another position as a research assistant on a study of young people who inject drugs in New York City. That showed me what it is to do a research project. And that was a really interesting experience. And so then I was pretty interested in understanding substance use, and that became my research interest. And I went to graduate school, and then a few years later, many years later, I graduated, and
yeah.
it took a little while, but that's okay. And I was considered a medical sociologist with an interest in substance use, and then a job ad came about. I was looking for a job teaching sociology,
Hmm.
and it was
Sure.
at Southern Oregon University, and it was looking for a sociologist that studies substance use. And you don't really ever see those jobs. I was like, what? This is my job. Um,
I want this.
yeah, I was like, this is never in job ads. They usually just say they want a medical sociologist and they don't specify exactly, or it'll be something not, it's usually not substance use. They're not looking. And I was like, wow, okay, this is it. And it also involved, coordinating the human service program. And I had done human service work as somebody who'd, worked at
Hmm.
that agency in Detroit and as a
Right.
methadone counselor. And so I was like, oh wow, this is a good fit. And so I came for the interview, and it was, I think, January, and it was sunny, and it wasn't that cold. It wasn't raining. And I was like, ooh, this is beautiful. And Ashland was just such like a sweet little town. And uh, I I enjoyed everybody I met, during the interview, and that was that. That's how I ended up here.
Well, excellent. You've used a term I think we should probably discuss, harm reduction. That for a person on the street, that may not make any sense. So I also want to clear up the difference between a sociological and a psychological perspective towards studying substance abuse. I think that's probably important in this conversation to keep things clear.
Yeah, I think and this is a confusion I hear a lot from students and just out in talking to people. I think sometimes people confuse even sociologists with psychologists a little bit. And we do similar work in that we're both really interested in why people do what they do and what's going on out in the world among people. But when I take a sociological view towards substance use, I'm looking more at social contexts and social patterns and kind of backing up from like what's going on inside someone's brain and what are they thinking to think to more of like what are sort of the patterns we're seeing among substance users. Why are some communities impacted in more harmful ways than others by substance use? You know, what do we know about the economy and that context and how that has been it has been a social driver of the opioid epidemic. So kind of moving out into these more macro perspectives. And psychology does, and I don't want to misrepresent psychology because I'm not a psychologist, but it looks rightfully so at neurological responses to substance use and addiction. And certainly sociology acknowledges that and knows that there's some sort of brain, you know, something going on in the brain and it could be a disease or a disorder, but um, it's also looking at, you know, like why do we consider substance use a disease? Like that's interesting that that's like a social narrative and you know, and how addiction has become medicalized, you know, historically it wasn't always considered a disease. Um, and just sort of that process is interesting to think about. So it goes in a bunch of different directions, but that's kind of the difference there. And then harm reduction is a lot of different things. It can mean a lot of different things. It's, you know, kind of a philosophy of care.
Hmm.
It's a public health response. It's a social movement. It's a set of practices, and it's all about, as the, you know, as the words say, it's about reducing harm or reducing riskiness. And I study it as it applies to people who are using drugs, but harm reduction can be thought of in any context, really. I mean, it can be about wearing seatbelts, or um, it can be, you know, condom use. That's another way it's been talked about. You know, even I've talked about harm reduction responses to addressing alcohol use among college students, like, you know,
Yeah.
drink drink a lot of water. If you're going to be out drinking alcohol, drink a lot of water, or eat, make sure you've eaten a full meal,
Mhm.
space out your drinks. So it's all about, the harm reduction response is about not saying don't do this. It's about saying, how, if you're going to do it anyways, you know, how can you do it in a safer way?
Okay.
um, so that's and so with substance use, one of the main sort of like flagship harm reduction programs is needle exchange programs, which came about in the 80s and 90s in response to HIV. Um, and now we talk about the overdose epidemic and the medication to reverse opioid overdoses, Narcan or naloxone. So that's a harm reduction response to.
I was interested to see a while back, pre-COVID, they actually have distributed Narcan throughout the library. My office is within the Hannon Library, and there are several locations throughout the library. In addition to us getting the AEDs and things like that, there are several. We took the Narcan training, and there are, I guess, little kits that we have, and that was kind of interesting. That whole dialogue of public response and attitudes has always fascinated me. From the hang 'em all to
Oh yeah.
get like in Denmark, there's a little area you can go do whatever you
Yes.
want, I guess.
Yes, yeah, there's a you're right, there's a wide range of responses there. Like when I was doing research and living in the Midwest, you know, there was there was this idea of limiting how many times a person could have their overdose reversed. So at some point, if the ambulances and the EMTs had already reversed a few overdoses for that person, they were just supposed to let them die, which is just, you know, it's hard to, I mean, that was
Oh,
going to be a policy in Ohio, in a county in Ohio. I don't know what happened with, I don't think that ever went into place, but it was like a three strikes and you're out kind of situation.
yipes.
Yeah, yeah. So Yeah, there's a lot of, I know there, so there is a ton of, stigma and judgment around substance use in our society. I mean, in some ways it makes sense because substance use can have really negative outcomes, and be really damaging for individuals and families. But also it's a person who's having a tough go at it, and they're struggling. Likely they're struggling with some sort of underlying mental health issues, and have had probably some pretty traumatic experiences in life. And so I I think, approaching it with empathy and not passing judgment. You don't know the life that people have lived. I think that's kind of the best approach. And I know it's the thought of reversing an overdose, like actually being the person to do it, is maybe scary for people.
Oh, I'm sure it is.
And you don't know how people are going to react and what will happen. And I've only been around when one overdose was reversed at one of my jobs, and I wasn't the person to do it, but I was there, and the person who was like revived was thankful. They didn't like get violent or angry, or it wasn't. So that was my one experience. Yeah, I know people. I understand, being nervous about it, but I'm so glad that there are the kits around campus. And one little story that happened in one of my classes, well, the sociology of drug use class that I
Mm-hmm.
teach, is that I had wanted to get the students, all of the students, to participate in a training for how to reverse overdoses and to be given naloxone kits or Narcan kits so that they could have them. And I was able to get the training, but because the Narcan and the naloxone is pretty expensive, the person who did the training couldn't provide them. Really, they wanted to, save them for families of substance users and people that
Right.
are around substance users on a regular basis. Well, lo and behold, one of my students, a few weeks later, would emailed me and said, "Last night my boyfriend overdosed." I had no idea that he was, that this would happen. He had taken a pill that he didn't know was laced with fentanyl, and she came home and he was, overdosing.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
she didn't have a kit because we didn't give like them the kits. And so it made me really realize that you just don't know when this is going to happen. And people, she didn't know that this was a possibility in her life. Um and so I think it's good to just spread the kits out there. And this year I am giving the kits to my students.
Talking about the emotions, there is, the tragedy of seeing this person in this condition, plus seeing the person who's trying to help them upset. And it seems like emotion has a really strong place in this discussion. Maybe that's my personal impression, but I wanted to toss that out there.
That is so insightful. Yes, it's huge, and it's at the root of why people are using. It you know it impacts families. I teach this really wonderful ethnography of about heroin users, Latinx heroin users in northern New Mexico in the late 90s. And it talks about this feeling of melancholy, that just this eternal sort of sadness experienced by some of the people who are using heroin, and this sort of never-ending feeling they have when of not being able to sort of escape the sadness. And um, so it's just really sorry. I'm really sorry. My cat is just freaking out.
No problems. Let's meet the kitty. Come on
let
in.
me let me get
Sure.
her.
All right. So we have a guest appearance by the family cat. Who is that, by the way?
Oh, that's Chloe. We've had her for maybe 12 or 13 years. She's very friendly.
Apparently so, yes.
Yes.
Well, welcome, Chloe. We were talking about the emotions and how it can impact family. As a faculty person, as someone working with students, I'd like to hear a little bit about what you are seeing, what you're observing through your interaction with the students, like the person who had their boyfriend. I didn't know he was on drugs, and all of a sudden, boom. What's that like today compared back to when you were younger and we
Hmm.
had dinosaurs chasing us home from school, but when I was younger, but there have been changes in
Oh yeah.
perceptions and beliefs and all of that. What are our students up to today, I guess, is where I'm going.
Um, oh, that's a good question. I don't always get all of that information from students. But um, they, well, in the human service program, there's a fair amount of students who are in recovery who are interested in human service work, and that's, because of their personal experience. Um, and I'm trying to think, in the few conversations I've had, I feel in some ways it's kind of similar to what I saw and witnessed when I was an undergraduate. There's, people using psychedelics and cannabis um but what I've read and what I know from research is that opioids are a part of the picture now, I think more than they were. And I haven't had, well, I guess I had that student,
Mhm.
mention opioid use. And but I'm not so certain how exactly at SOU, but I do know that in high schools, and maybe it's less now, the opioid use and the use of like Oxycontin or other painkillers, because they've really cracked down through regulations on dispensing those and on
Mhm.
prescribing them. Um, so that might be a bit less. But I do know, in terms of, this is a little diverging from your question, but
Oh, it's
on the
okay.
black market, is just saturated with fentanyl and other really, really strong opioids, so that people who were maybe using heroin and have been using it for some years have seen a real change in what's out there. And that's why we're seeing so many overdose deaths, is that there's just really, really strong opioids in the mix. And I think that that filters into thinking about what might be happening among SOU students, high school students, because some of them may have access to those substances, and there can be very much stronger than I think people are expecting.
I'm hearing more and more that that is exactly the case. A person goes out and gets their regular size portion, and they're used to getting this much, but in fact, they get this much out of it, and they're either terribly sick or dead, or yeah.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
interesting how the market, some people have claimed, and this is an honest question, this popped into my head,
Hmm.
have some of the attempts to stop certain drugs being given led to different drugs like the fentanyl replacing the oxycodone, but now this is stronger, and now we're seeing more and more people having this difficulty. And that's kind of an interesting quandary, because you do want to stop illegal drugs, but on the other hand, it's really difficult to stop because it just keeps popping up. It's like whack-a-mole.
Yep, exactly. And I mean, that's the question I really aim my teaching at when I'm teaching sociology classes, is why is there this demand, this like never ending demand for pain relief, or for, to use substances? What's going on, and why has, I think we could say we've seen an increase with the opioid epidemic. There's certainly a lot more people using those types of drugs. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, I mean, so to answer your question, though, the way that the opioid epidemic has been studied or understood is that it came in three waves. So the first was the addiction to the painkillers that were widely prescribed,
Mhm.
and then there was the crackdown on prescribing, and a lot of regulations went into place. And then so people shifted over to using heroin. That's the second wave. And then the third wave was the entrance of fentanyl and really strong opioid analogs into the black market drug
Mm.
supply and all the overdoses that resulted. So, and I think fentanyl entered the supply because, in part, it's really uh, lucrative and easy to sell because it you just need a small amount and it's very strong. So it's easier to like mail and transport and I think maybe more lucrative because because it's so strong, it can sell better. Yeah, that's something I'm still learning about. That's
I would imagine it could be stepped on. As they step on heroin, they add this, that, or the other. So X amount becomes X amount. And I've heard there's a lot of difficulty on what they use to cut, because in some cases it can be damaging, even if the drug is good, and that is quality wise, what they're using to extend it.
yes.
It's like hamburger helper. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, laundry detergent, thing
baby laxative.
yeah, you hear things, yeah.
Woof.
And one thing I think is interesting, different than my experience working in the East, is that in the West, it's mainly black tar heroin, which is kind
Oh,
of a tarry, goopy um, substance that you can, you can use water to like mix it up and make it into a liquid and then inject it. But I don't mean to be teaching people how to use drugs, but the point of what I'm saying is that with black tar, it's adding in fentanyl or adding in adulterating it with some other substances is more difficult, so that it ends up being like, I guess people have talked about it as like a chocolate chip cookie, so that there'll be like a really big chip or burst of fentanyl contained within the glob
ah,
of um,
okay.
black
So it's like
tar.
concentrated in one spot, not distributed throughout the dose.
Exactly. Exactly. So
Well, yipes. Okay, we've talked about what's going on. Let's talk about things that you're doing in your teaching. We've talked about the harm reduction. We've talked about being about the awareness, the things you're sharing with your student to help us deal with these kind of issues, and maybe some of the things you'd like to see happening within the future at SOU, some goals you have for the program.
sure. Well, I have been working and try to stay pretty connected to the community, and that through forming sort of connections with human service agencies and the executive directors and people working there, and trying to stay in touch with what like community needs are out there. And what I've heard a few times is that really a harm reduction response is what these community agencies want. And what they mean by that is not always an abstinence free response, but or an anti-abstinence response. But what they mean is more of like a non-judgmental, sort of radically empathetic response to people whose life choices you might think critically about. So they really need caring, empathetic workers out there. And so I really try to teach that in my classes through the sociological approach towards understanding why people's lives are the way they are and what things have been out of their hands, or why did they make those decisions that on the surface look bad, but to them made a lot of sense in the moment. So, given their life experience and sort of the lack of resources they may have had, or the discrimination they've experienced, or the mistrust they have in social institutions. So, so really try to get that perspective in there.
Mhm.
Um, and in terms of thinking about long-term goals and well, I'm interested and involved right now in trying to help get a pathway for students who are interested in becoming certified alcohol and drug counselors.
Mhm.
And that's a state certification that you can get with a bachelor's degree. You just need to take a set of courses, which I'm trying to put together. So I'm not making any promises because it's still very much in progress, but I am trying to make it so that, yeah, students can graduate and then they have to do a certain amount of hours in the field and then take
Mhm.
an exam, and they can become KDAC certified. which we need in this area because I think a couple years ago it came out that Oregon has like the lowest amount of treatment centers or drug treatment available, or maybe like it's like the 47th state in the country in terms of how much drug treatment is available.
Wow.
So,
Not an
yeah,
admirable position.
no. So there's a real lack. So I really want to help to get people out there who are non-judgmental, who are going to be really, empathetic, great workers, and have good training in this. So that's a goal. I hope we can do it. And then I also, like, one of my dreams, and this is sort of connected to my, well, it's definitely connected to my work, is to open a harm reduction center in Medford. I with a group of people, obviously.
Sure,
I'd love.
sure.
I'm just starting. The pandemic kind of interfered, but I'm just starting to meet other harm reduction practitioners in the area. And when I was in New York working there, I worked out of a harm reduction center, which is essentially a needle exchange, but it's kind of freestanding, and it's like a social services hub that takes a harm reduction approach and offers, drop-in services for people, and that would be a great connection for students who are interested in, learning more about that and having practicums there and
Some
things like that.
practical learning experience, exactly.
That's a dream, but that may never happen. But I'll just put it out there.
Well, good for you. You got to speak it, then it can become real.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for coming in today. Before I bounce out of here, is there anything that I didn't quite cover that you wanted to bring up? I'd like to make sure we've covered the subject
Hmm.
completely for you.
No, I think you brought up a lot of that was a really like holistic set of questions. That was, yeah.
Well, again, thank you for coming in, and we look forward to hearing more about your adventures. Feel free to reach out and updating us with anything that you feel is worthwhile. We're happy to get information to the campus and the community.
All right. Thank you so much. This was really nice.
Okay, take care. Bye bye.
Bye.